Renee Carter never thought serving one last meal would cost her everything. One rainy night, a mystery man walked into the diner just before closing, exhausted and silent. She could have turned him away. She should have. But instead she broke the rules, and by morning she was jobless, humiliated, and furious. What she didn't know was that the man she served wasn't just anyone, and that one act of kindness would change her life forever. They say one decision can change the course of a person's life. For Renee Carter, that decision came late on a stormy night in Chicago, Illinois. She didn't know that by choosing kindness over the rules, she would set off a chain of events that would shake her world to its core. The rain pounded against the windows of Frankie's Diner, where Renee had spent the last 12 years serving coffee, wiping down tables, and scraping together every penny to support her two children, Damon and Ava. She was used to the long nights, the aching feet, and the rude customers, but this night was different. At 11:27 p.m., just 3 minutes before the no customers after 11:30 rule kicked in, the front door creaked open. A tall, hooded figure stepped inside, dripping wet from the storm. His broad shoulders and quiet demeanor made him seem both imposing and exhausted. Renee's instinct told her to turn him away. She glanced at the clock. 3 minutes left, but something about the way he stood there, shoulders sagging, made her pause. One meal wouldn't hurt. She had no idea that this small act of defiance would cost her everything, or so she thought. Renee Carter's hands trembled as she wiped down the counter, exhaustion weighing on her like a cement block. The cheap sneakers she'd bought on clearance last year barely cushioned her aching feet after another 14-hour shift at Frankie's Diner. Her uniform smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and the lemon-scented cleaner she used at closing time. She glanced at the clock. 11:27 p.m. 3 more minutes. Then she could finally drag herself home, collapse onto her worn-out couch, and pray that she could wake up early enough to drive Damon to practice before heading to her second job. Her 15-year-old son had a gift. Everyone said it. Fast hands, sharp instincts, a jump shot that could take him far. But talent wasn't enough. The $750 basketball camp could open doors, college scouts, scholarships, a real shot at something better. But how could she ever afford it? The stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table haunted her. Rent was overdue. Electricity notice. Final warning. Her 9-year-old daughter, Ava, had outgrown her shoes, but new ones would have to wait. Everything had to wait. No one understood how hard it was, how unfair it felt to work yourself to the bone, only to fall further behind. She kept smiling at customers, kept pushing through the exhaustion, because what choice did she have? When the hooded stranger walked in at closing time, her gut told her to send him away, but something in his posture, that same weary weight she carried every single day, made her hesitate. What was one more act of kindness, even if it cost her? The wind howled outside as Renee Carter pulled her apron strings loose, ready to clock out. Almost home. Almost done. Then the bell above the door jingled. Her heart sank. Not now. A tall man, his hood pulled low, stood dripping in the doorway. Water pooled at his feet as he hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner. His presence sent a flicker of unease through Renee. He was big, broad-shouldered, and silent. Her fingers twitched toward the closed sign. Behind her, the kitchen lights dimmed. Howard, the diner's owner, had strict rules. No customers after 11:30 p.m. No exceptions. Insurance policies, he always said. Liability issues. You get one rule breaker, and the whole place falls apart. It wasn't worth it. She should send him away. But then the man exhaled, shoulders slumping, and Renee saw it, that same exhaustion she felt in her bones every day. How many times had she stood just like that? Too tired to keep going, too broke to stop. Kitchen's about to close, she called, against her better judgment. If you order quick, I can still get you something. His head lifted slightly. Dark eyes met hers. Tired, but grateful. Thank you, he said, voice low and rough, like he wasn't used to speaking much. Renee turned toward the kitchen, already regretting it. If Howard found out, it was over. She told herself it was just one meal, just one moment of kindness. What she didn't know was that this choice would destroy her life, or rebuild it into something greater than she ever imagined. Renee felt the heat of Howard's rules pressing down on her, as she grabbed a clean plate from the stack. This was a mistake. The man sat quietly in the corner booth, his wet sweatshirt clinging to his frame. He didn't pull out his phone, didn't check the menu, just stared at the table, lost in thought. Something about him felt familiar. "What can I get you?" she asked, keeping her voice light, though her hands trembled. He looked up, hesitating. "Coffee. Black." She jotted it down. "You need more than just coffee," she said. Then, before she could stop herself, added the one thing that made her feel like home. "Our steak and eggs are the best in the city." The man exhaled a small laugh, like he hadn't expected kindness tonight. "That sounds perfect." Renee rushed the order to the kitchen, heart pounding. If Howard saw this on the cameras, she was done. But as the smell of sizzling steak filled the air, guilt melted away. She glanced at the stranger, still sitting in silence. A man like him, built like a pro athlete, but quiet like a ghost. "I have a son who plays basketball," she said casually, as she set down his food. "He's real good, trying to get into a training camp this summer." Something shifted in the man's expression. His hood slipped back just enough for her to recognize his face. Renee's heart slammed against her ribs. She had just broken the rules to serve Elijah West, one of the greatest players to ever touch a basketball. The next morning, Renee walked into Frankie's diner, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had barely slept, but for once, it wasn't from stress, it was from hope. The $1,000 tip Elijah West had left behind meant that Damon's basketball camp was paid for. She could already hear his excitement when she told him. For the first time in a long time, she had good news. But before she could even tie her apron, Howard's voice cut through the diner like a blade. "My office." Now. Renee's stomach turned. She followed him into the cramped office at the back, where the security footage from last night played on the screen. The timestamp glowed like a death sentence. 11:47 p.m. Howard slammed his hand on the desk. "You think I wouldn't see this?" Renee clenched her fists. "He was hungry, Howard. It was raining. I wasn't gonna kick him out like a dog." "I don't pay you to feel sorry for people," he snapped. "I pay you to follow rules." Her blood boiled. 12 years, Howard. 12 years. I've covered shifts, cleaned after hours, dealt with rude customers, and you're firing me over one plate of food. Howard crossed his arms. "You broke policy. It's that simple." Renee's throat tightened. Rent, groceries, Damon's camp. What was she supposed to do now? She ripped the name tag off her shirt and slammed it on his desk. "Go to hell, Howard." She walked out with her head high, even as her world came crashing down around her. Renee stormed out of Frankie's diner, rage burning through her veins. The cold Chicago air slapped her face, but she barely felt it. 12 years. 12 years of loyalty, of overtime, of missing her kids' school events. All for what? To be tossed aside like garbage over one meal. She gritted her teeth, her mind racing. Rent was due in a week. No paycheck. No backup plan. The $1,000 tip that was supposed to send Damon to camp would now go straight to keeping the lights on. Her fingers tightened around her phone. She should call her sister, maybe even her old co-worker Maria, but she couldn't stomach the pity in their voices. Before she could decide, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something told her to pick up. "Hello?" she answered, her voice still sharp from the argument. A smooth, professional voice responded. "Is this Renee Carter?" She frowned. "Who's asking?" "I'm calling on behalf of Elijah West. He'd like to meet with you this morning at his facility in downtown Chicago. Are you available?" Renee's breath caught in her throat. Her knees nearly buckled. Elijah West, the man she had served last night, the man who unknowingly got her fired. Her eyes flicked back toward the diner, where Howard was watching her through the window, smug as ever. Her grip tightened on the phone. "I guess I am now," she said, her voice firm. She had no idea what Elijah West wanted, but she was damn sure going to find out. Renee sat gripping the steering wheel of her beat-up Toyota, staring up at the gleaming West Athletic Complex in downtown Chicago. The building looked like something from another world, all glass and steel, towering over the city like a monument to success. She had no business being here. Her uniform from Frankie's diner still smelled like coffee and bacon grease. She had planned to go home and figure out how to tell Damon and Ava that she lost her job, but instead, here she was, called in like she was someone important. She took a breath and stepped inside. A well-dressed woman with a clipboard greeted her. "Miss Carter, Mr. West is expecting you." "Mr. West." Just last night, she had served him steak and eggs like any other late-night customer. Now she was about to meet him in his world. She was led into a massive office, where Elijah West sat behind a sleek desk. He looked different without the hood. Sharper, focused, but still carrying something heavy in his eyes. "You're probably wondering why you're here," he said, his voice smooth, commanding. Renee crossed her arms. "Yeah, I'd say so." Elijah leaned forward. "I've been looking for someone like you." She laughed dryly. "Like me? I'm a fired waitress." "No," he said. "You're someone who does what's right, even when it costs you." He slid a folder across the desk. "I want you to run my new youth program. Full salary, full benefits, and your son, Damon. He gets a spot in my elite training camp." Renee's heart pounded. This wasn't just an offer. This was a way out. Renee stared at the folder on Elijah West's desk, her fingers twitching. A real job, a real salary, a way out of the cycle she had been stuck in for years. But it was too good to be true. She let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head. "You're telling me you want me, a waitress who just got fired, to run a youth program? I don't have a degree. I've never worked in an office. I don't know anything about running a foundation." Elijah leaned back, watching her. "You know struggle. You know what it's like to fight for your kids, to make sure they don't fall through the cracks. That's exactly why I want you." Renee folded her arms, trying to ignore the hope rising in her chest. "Why me? Why not someone with a business degree, or a fancy resume?" Elijah tapped his fingers on the desk. "Because I've spent my whole career surrounded by people with perfect resumes. But last night, I saw something in you. You could have turned me away. You knew you'd get in trouble. But you still did what was right." He slid the contract closer to her. "That's the kind of person I need." Renee swallowed hard. The bills, the eviction notices, Damon Sitt's dream. She thought of Howard Sitt's smirk as he fired her. Wouldn't Sitt he love to see her beg for her old job back? She exhaled sharply and picked up the pen. "I don't need the weekend," she said. "I stepped him in." Renee pulled into the driveway, gripping the steering wheel as she tried to steady her nerves. She had walked into Frankie's diner that morning, expecting another grueling shift, and somehow she had walked out with a job offer from one of the greatest basketball players of all time. Her hands were still shaking when she stepped inside. Damon was at the table, flicking through his worn-out basketball magazine, the same one he'd read 100 times. Ova ran up first. "Mama, why are you home so early?" Renee forced a smile. "Got a new job today, baby." Damon's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" She sat down across from him, setting the West Athletic Complex folder on the table. "Elijah West. I served him last night at the diner. Turns out he's been watching me, or more like, watching people who actually give a damn about their community." She took a deep breath. "He offered me a job running his new youth program." Damon's brows furrowed. "Wait, Elijah West? Like Elijah West?" Renee smirked. "The one and only, and there's more." She pushed the folder toward him. "He wants you in his elite training camp." Damon's chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. "No way, no way." His voice cracked, his eyes shining. "Are you serious?" Renee laughed, the tension in her chest finally breaking. "You tell me." Damon looked down at the folder, hands shaking as he opened it. For the first time in a long time, his dream wasn't just a dream anymore. Renee was barely settling into her new role when she stumbled upon something that made her stomach drop. She had spent the last few weeks learning everything about Elijah West's Youth Foundation, its programs, scholarships, funding. It was overwhelming but fulfilling, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger than survival. Then, one afternoon as she reviewed the foundation's financial reports, something didn't add up. At first she thought she was reading it wrong. But no, the numbers were shifting. Money was being logged as received that hadn't actually come in yet. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. It made the foundation look financially stronger than it was, but in reality, they were spending money they didn't have. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just a clerical error. This could ruin everything. Her first instinct was to ignore it. This wasn't her problem. She wasn't an accountant. She wasn't even qualified for this job. If she reported it, what if they thought she was accusing someone important? What if she lost everything she had just gained? Then she thought of Damon. Ova, all the kids depending on this foundation. She clenched her jaw, grabbed her phone, and dialed Elijah's private number. The line rang once, twice. Then his deep voice came through. "Renee?" She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "Mr. West, we need to talk. It's about the foundation's finances, and it's serious." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then finally, "Come to my office." Now. Renee's heart pounded as she walked through the glass doors of West Athletic Complex, her fingers clenched around the financial report. This was it. She had barely started this job, and now she was about to risk everything. The receptionist glanced up. "Mr. West is expecting you." She barely heard the words as she stepped into the elevator, her pulse hammering in her ears. Was she making a mistake? When she entered Elijah's office, he was already standing, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The man who had given her a way out now looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. She didn't hesitate. She placed the documents on his desk. "There's a problem with the foundation's finances. Someone's marking pledged donations as if they've already been received. That means we're spending money we don't actually have." Elijah didn't move. He just stared at her, his jaw tight. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back. "And you're telling me this, knowing it could blow up your entire job?" Renee swallowed hard. "I'd rather lose this job than let these kids lose their futures." For a long moment, silence. Then Elijah did something she didn't expect. He smiled. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." Renee blinked. "What?" Elijah tapped the folder. "This was a test, a final one. To see if you'd stand up for what's right, no matter what it cost you." He slid a new contract across the desk. "You just passed. Welcome to the executive team." Renee sat in Elijah West's office staring at the new contract in front of her. Executive Director. The title felt too big, too impossible for someone who had spent the last 12 years serving coffee and scrubbing diner floors. "You want me to run the entire foundation?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah leaned forward, his expression serious. "You proved something today. You don't just care about rules or keeping your job. You care about what's right. That's the kind of leadership we need." Renee swallowed hard. The numbers, the risks, the responsibility. It was overwhelming, but then she thought about Damon, Ava, all the kids whose futures were riding on this program. She picked up the pen and signed. A week later, West Athletic Complex buzzed with energy. Kids sprinted across the courts, their sneakers squeaking against polished floors. The foundation was no longer just an idea. It was alive. And that wasn't all. Elijah had quietly purchased Frankie's Diner, converting it into a youth training center. Where there were once greasy tables and overworked waitresses, there were now basketball hoops, mentorship programs, and classrooms. When Renee drove past, she saw Howard standing outside, watching the transformation unfold. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Renee didn't feel anger or resentment. She just felt pride, because this was bigger than revenge. This was about changing lives, and it had all started with one act of kindness. Renee sat at her desk, flipping through the latest financial reports, expecting everything to be in order. She had fought too hard for this, and after weeks of learning the ins and outs of the foundation, she was finally settling into her role. But then, a problem. Her eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. At first glance, the numbers looked clean, but as she dug deeper, a sick feeling twisted in her gut. Someone had been counting pledged donations as actual income. Again, but this time, the discrepancies were larger, more frequent. This wasn't just an accounting error. Her hands clenched. This could destroy everything they had built. Her first instinct was to call Elijah, to bring it to his attention immediately. But something made her pause. What if someone inside the foundation was covering their tracks? What if they were counting on her staying quiet? Her breath came faster. Was this another test? Or was this real? She stared at the reports, her mind racing. If she exposed this and was wrong, she could risk everything. But if she stayed quiet and it was real, the entire foundation could collapse. She thought about Damon, Ava, the kids training on the courts below, the single parents working 2 jobs to give their children a chance. Her jaw tightened. She picked up her phone and dialed a different number this time. Not Elijah. The board. "This is Renee Carter. We have a serious problem and I need an emergency meeting." Now, she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a leader, and she wasn't backing down. Renee stood at the head of the conference room table, her pulse steady as she faced the foundation's board members. She had spent the last 12 years taking orders, biting her tongue, and trying to survive. Not anymore. She laid out the financial discrepancies, presenting evidence of how pledged donations were being counted as received funds. This wasn't just a miscalculation. It was a desperate attempt to make the books look stronger than they were. Silence filled the room. Then Elijah West leaned forward. "And what do you think we should do?" Renee didn't hesitate. "We fix it, right now. We stop spending money we don't have, and find real solutions. If we don't, we're no better than the system we're trying to fight." A slow smile spread across Elijah's face. "That's exactly why I put you in this position." That evening, Renee stood at the grand opening of the first converted Frankie's Youth Center, watching kids race onto the courts. Damon stood beside her, his West Elite jersey crisp and new. "You did this, Mama," he said, pride in his voice. Renee smiled, watching the future unfold. No, they did this together. Renee Carter's story proves that one act of kindness can change everything. She lost her job for doing what was right, but in the end she gained something far greater: purpose, leadership, and a chance to uplift others. Her journey teaches us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. In a world that often values rules over people, integrity stands out. It also reminds us that opportunities don't always come dressed as success. Sometimes they come disguised as failure, rejection, or struggle. Most importantly, Renee's story shows that true power lies in lifting others. When we choose compassion over convenience, we don't just change one life, we change entire communities. What choice will you make today?